Mrs. Henderson, a woman who prided herself on order and authority, was enjoying her perfectly brewed morning coffee on her manicured porch. The sun was just peeking over the impeccably trimmed hedges of Heron Creek, casting long, peaceful shadows. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, a sound that usually brought her immense satisfaction. But then, a sharp, insistent rap echoed through the quiet morning, a sound far too firm for a delivery, too official for a neighbor. She lowered her ceramic mug, a faint frown creasing her brow. Two tall figures stood on her doorstep, dressed in dark, crisp suits, their faces unreadable, almost like statues. They weren't from the neighborhood, that was certain. One of them, a man with a steady gaze and a neat, graying beard, held up a small leather wallet with a badge inside. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable weight. "We're from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk to you about a certain boat." Her heart gave a sudden, unexpected lurch, splashing a tiny bit of coffee over the rim of her mug. Her carefully constructed morning calm shattered. What boat? Why would they be here? The gentle breeze suddenly felt cold. The story of the boat, and how it led to that unexpected visit, began long before Mrs. Henderson's crisp morning coffee. It started in the heart of Heron Creek, a coastal community that truly lived up to its name, with winding creeks that fed into a sparkling bay. It was a place where children rode bikes freely down tree-lined streets and neighbors often gathered for impromptu barbecues. Life here moved at a comfortable, steady pace, much like the gentle tides that ebbed and flowed in the nearby water. In this peaceful haven lived David, a man whose presence was as comforting as the warm scent of baking bread. David wasn't just a resident, he was a pillar of the community, the kind of person who always had an extra set of hands ready to help, a listening ear, or a kind word to share. He was known for his calm demeanor and his genuine interest in others. If a neighbor's car broke down, David was there with his toolkit. If a storm knocked out power, he was the first to offer warm coffee and a charging station from his generator. His yard, while not as meticulously groomed as Mrs. Henderson's, was always neat and boasted a vibrant array of native wildflowers, a small rebellion against the perfectly uniform lawns preferred by some in the community. He believed in blending with nature, not conquering it. David's greatest joy, his true passion, was his boat, a sturdy 20-foot fishing vessel he affectionately called the Seafarer. She wasn't a sleek, modern yacht, but a practical, well-maintained boat with a faded blue hull and a reliable engine that hummed a happy tune. David had spent countless hours restoring her, sanding down old paint, repairing the engine, and polishing every brass fitting until it gleamed. The scent of saltwater and engine oil clung to the Seafarer like a second skin, a smell David found immensely comforting. She was more than just a boat, she was a vessel of dreams, a floating classroom, and a quiet sanctuary. The Seafarer usually rested gently at the community dock, a long wooden pier that stretched out into one of Heron Creek's wider inlets. This dock was a shared space, a place where folks would fish, watch the sunset, or simply enjoy the salty air. David had been using that particular spot for years, long before the current HOA, presided over by Mrs. Henderson, had even gained its firm grip on the community's daily life. His boat was always tied securely, kept clean, and never obstructed anyone. He followed every rule, and then some, always ensuring his presence was a benefit, not a burden. One of David's favorite things to do with the Seafarer was to take children from the neighborhood out on short fishing trips. He loved seeing their eyes light up when they reeled in a small flounder or spotted a playful dolphin. He taught them about the delicate balance of the ocean, the importance of respecting marine life, and the quiet patience fishing required. He shared stories of the bay, teaching them about different tides and the kinds of fish that lived beneath the surface. He wasn't just teaching them to fish, he was teaching them about nature, responsibility, and the simple joy of being out on the water. Little Timmy, a shy boy who rarely spoke, would transform into a chattering explorer on David's boat, his face aglow with excitement. Sarah, who was usually glued to her tablet, would put it down the moment she stepped aboard, fascinated by the rhythm of the waves. David's boat trips were legendary among the younger residents, a rite of passage, a secret club that everyone wanted to join. Mrs. Henderson, the formidable president of the Heron Creek Homeowners Association, had moved into the community about 5 years ago. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper opinions, meticulously dressed and always perfectly coiffed. She approached her role as HOA president with the seriousness of a CEO running a multinational corporation. For Mrs. Henderson, rules weren't just guidelines, they were sacred texts, and adherence to them was paramount. Her mission, as she saw it, was to elevate Heron Creek to a standard of impeccable uniformity and pristine appearance. She'd quickly risen through the ranks of the HOA board, her arguments for stricter enforcement and more detailed regulations proving persuasive to enough residents who desired a seemingly perfect neighborhood. Initially, Mrs. Henderson's interactions with David were polite, if a little formal. She'd nod curtly when they passed, perhaps commenting on the weather or the health of her rose bushes. There was always an underlying current of assessment in her gaze, a subtle evaluation of whether everything in David's world met her unspoken criteria. David, being David, treated her with the same kindness and respect he offered everyone. He'd even helped her nephew, a young man named Alex, when his car had inconveniently broken down right in front of Mrs. Henderson's house. David had patiently worked on the engine, getting it running again in less than an hour, refusing any payment, only accepting a glass of Mrs. Henderson's famous iced tea. "Just happy to help a neighbor," he'd said with a warm smile, oblivious to the fact that Mrs. Henderson probably noted the oil stain on his shirt more than his generosity. Over time, the HOA's rules began to tighten, subtly at first, then more overtly. New amendments appeared in the monthly newsletter, printed in crisp, official fonts. All trash bins must be stored completely out of sight, no unapproved exterior modifications, lawn maintenance to be completed weekly, adhering to precise height standards. David, ever compliant, adjusted his small world to fit these growing regulations. He built a small, attractive wooden enclosure for his trash bins. He kept his wildflower garden neatly contained. The Seafarer, however, started to become a point of quiet contention. Mrs. Henderson introduced a new dock usage addendum. It was lengthy, filled with legalistic jargon, and seemed to have been drafted with a specific target in mind: boats like David's. It detailed new fees, new permits, and stricter size and appearance requirements. David dutifully paid the new fees, obtained the necessary permits, and even gave the Seafarer an extra coat of wax, ensuring she looked her best. He wanted to cause no trouble, wanting only to enjoy his passion and share it with the kids. He saw the HOA as a necessary part of community living, and he believed in compromise. He even attended the HOA meetings, listening patiently to Mrs. Henderson's lengthy pronouncements, often being the one to ask clarifying questions about how new rules would genuinely benefit the community. He was never confrontational, but always thoughtful. The general mood in Heron Creek also began to shift under Mrs. Henderson's presidency. While some appreciated the new order, others felt a creeping sense of unease. Children were told not to play on certain patches of grass. Small, personal touches that made each house unique were slowly being phased out. David noticed it, too. The spontaneous barbecues became less frequent. Neighbors seemed a little more reserved, less inclined to linger and chat. The warmth that had once been the hallmark of Heron Creek was subtly being replaced by a sense of watchful adherence. David continued his fishing trips, a quiet act of rebellion against the encroaching uniformity, a pocket of joy in a landscape that was becoming increasingly regulated. He felt a deep sense of responsibility for the children, for teaching them the values of freedom and respect for nature that the boat embodied. He bought new life jackets, checked the boat's engine even more frequently, and always carried extra snacks and water. He was a steward of fun, a guardian of simple pleasures. One sweltering July afternoon, David returned from a fishing trip with Timmy and Sarah, both beaming, their small buckets holding a couple of panfish. The sun was hot on his neck, and he was looking forward to a cool drink and a bit of rest. As they approached the community dock, a strange sight met his eyes. The Seafarer wasn't where he'd left her. His heart gave a jolt. She wasn't bobbing gently with the tide. In her place, a large, garish yellow sign, crudely hammered into the wooden dock, declared in bold, black letters, "No boats over 18 feet. Immediate removal and impoundment. HOA Rule 7.3b. Violators will be fined." David stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. Rule 7.3b? He had read every single amendment, every newsletter. There had been no mention of an 18-foot limit. The Seafarer was 20 feet. It was a new rule, sprung from nowhere, and clearly designed to target his boat specifically. Just then, a large, industrial-looking flatbed truck with a small crane attached backed clumsily towards the dock. Two burly men in work uniforms climbed out, their faces grim. Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, overseeing the operation, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Her usually neat hair was slightly askew from the heat, but her posture was as rigid as ever. "Mrs. Henderson, what is going on?" David asked, his voice steady despite the shock, the kids looking up at him, their smiles fading. She turned, her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Rodriguez, you are in violation of a new HOA regulation, effective immediately. Your boat is being impounded. You will be fined for its removal and storage." "New regulation? I haven't seen anything about an 18-foot limit," David countered, trying to keep his voice calm. "And you can't just seize my property without notice." "It was circulated this morning, Mr. Rodriguez." "Perhaps you missed your email," she said, a hint of condescension in her tone. "It's for the aesthetics of the community. Larger vessels simply clutter the dock." The board voted unanimously. As she spoke, the crane on the truck began to extend its arm, a large hook dangling menacingly. David watched, horrified, as the two men expertly maneuvered a thick strap under the Seafarer. He could hear the grinding of the crane, the creaking of wood as his beloved boat was lifted, slowly, roughly, from the water. The boys watched, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sadness. A terrible scraping sound echoed as the Seafarer was dragged onto the flatbed. David felt a pang, like a part of his own heart was being ripped away. The damage was evident even from a distance. Paint scraped, a visible gouge on the hull where the strap had perhaps been too tight, a small crack near the bow. This wasn't just impoundment, this was deliberate destruction. Mrs. Henderson stood there, arms crossed, watching, a triumphant glint in her eyes. It was a clear statement. She had indeed messed with his boat. The brutal sight of the Seafarer being hauled onto the flatbed truck, bruised and damaged, burned in David's mind. The crane groaned, and the thick straps bit into the boat's fiberglass hull, leaving angry white gashes against the faded blue paint. It wasn't just the damage, it was the sheer disregard, the cold, calculated intent behind Mrs. Henderson's actions. The boys, Timmy and Sarah, stood silently beside David, their earlier joy replaced by a somber quietness. Timmy's lower lip trembled slightly, and Sarah gripped David's hand tightly, her small fingers digging into his palm. They had seen their friend, the happy boat, treated with such harshness. "This isn't right, Mrs. Henderson." David's voice, usually so calm, held a tremor of disbelief. He took a step forward, wanting to stop the men, to protect his boat. Mrs. Henderson, however, simply tilted her head, a small, unfeeling smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Rodriguez, I advise you not to interfere with HOA operations. You have violated a rule. There are consequences. You will receive a full invoice for the removal and storage. Perhaps next time, you will choose to adhere to the regulations." She then turned her back, dismissing him, and gestured to the truck driver, who promptly pulled away, the Seafarer swaying precariously on the back, heading towards an unknown destination. David stood there, watching the truck disappear around the bend, leaving him, the children, and the now empty dock behind. The setting sun, usually a comforting sight, cast a long, lonely shadow. He felt a deep ache, not just for the physical damage to his boat, but for the violation of trust, the deliberate unkindness shown by someone who was supposed to foster community, not destroy it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was a moment where he could react with anger, but he knew that wouldn't help. He had to think clearly for himself, and for the children who looked to him. He knelt down to the kids. "Hey, guys," he said softly, trying to inject some warmth into his voice. "That was a bit of a shock, wasn't it?" Timmy finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What happened to the Seafarer, David? Is she broken?" Sarah, tears welling in her eyes, added, "Will we still go fishing?" David gently squeezed their hands. "The Seafarer will be okay. She's a tough old boat. And yes, we will go fishing again. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Sometimes, when things seem really unfair, it's important to remember that kindness and fairness always win in the end. It just takes a little time and a lot of patience to show people the right way." He made sure they got home safely, reassuring them that everything would be all right, despite the raw feeling of injustice bubbling within him. He wanted to teach them that even in the face of unkindness, one must try to meet it with grace and a determination for what is right. Later that evening, after the initial shock had begun to wear off, David went back to the empty dock. The yellow sign still stood, a harsh beacon in the fading light. He took out his phone, his hand still trembling slightly, and snapped several photos of the sign, the empty space where his boat had been, and even the tire marks from the truck on the dock. He then walked along the dock, inspecting the boards, and found more evidence of the rough handling, splintered wood, fresh scratches, and even a discarded piece of rope from the impoundment. He took pictures of all of it, feeling a grim resolve setting in. This wasn't just about his boat, it was about Mrs. Henderson's abuse of power and the disregard for people's property and rights. He spent the next few hours meticulously searching through his emails and the HOA's online portal. He read through every single document, every single amendment, from the earliest ones he'd received to the most recent. His diligence paid off. There was no mention, anywhere, of a new 18-foot boat limit. The most recent dock usage amendment, passed just a month prior, focused on fees and maintenance schedules, not size restrictions. Mrs. Henderson had either fabricated the rule entirely or rushed it through without proper notice, which itself was a major violation of HOA bylaws. He printed everything, highlighting the relevant sections, creating a neat, organized file. He knew he couldn't let this slide. Not just for himself, but for the principle of the matter. If she could do this to him, what would stop her from doing it to others? The following morning, David woke up with a clear plan. He knew the HOA board met every second Tuesday of the month. He decided he wouldn't wait for that. He would start by sending a formal, polite, but firm letter to the entire HOA board, including Mrs. Henderson, demanding the immediate return of his boat and compensation for damages. He meticulously detailed the lack of proper notification for the supposed new rule, citing specific sections of the HOA's own bylaws that required advance notice for rule changes. He also included the photos he'd taken of the damaged dock and the impoundment sign, quietly noting the crude installation of the sign. He chose his words carefully, avoiding any emotional language, focusing purely on facts and the legal requirements the HOA itself was bound by. He emphasized that he was a long-standing, compliant resident and that such arbitrary actions created a hostile environment within the community. He ended the letter by stating his expectation of a prompt resolution. He then sent it via certified mail, ensuring he had proof of delivery. Days turned into a week. David received no response from the HOA board. Not an email, not a phone call, not even a form letter acknowledging his complaint. It was as if his detailed letter, with all its carefully collected evidence, had simply vanished into thin air. Mrs. Henderson continued to walk around Heron Creek with her usual air of self-importance, occasionally glancing his way with a hint of what he could only describe as disdain, or perhaps, amusement. It was clear she believed she had won, and that David would simply accept the loss. David, however, was not a man to be easily discouraged, especially when he knew he was in the right. He decided his next step would be to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting. He knew it would be uncomfortable, maybe even confrontational, but he believed in facing problems head-on, with civility and facts. He spent time preparing, anticipating every argument Mrs. Henderson might make, gathering more evidence, strengthening his case. He even spoke to a few neighbors who had also expressed quiet concerns about Mrs. Henderson's increasingly iron-fisted rule. Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind older woman who lived 2 doors down, confided that she'd had a similar issue with her small garden gnome collection being deemed non-conforming yard decor. They both shared a sense of growing frustration. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, overcast and muggy, mirroring the tension David felt. He arrived early at the community clubhouse, finding the room already buzzing with quiet chatter. The usual small crowd of residents was there, some looking curious, others a bit wary. Mrs. Henderson sat at the head of the long table, flanked by the other board members, her posture ramrod straight, a stack of papers meticulously arranged in front of her. She surveyed the room with an almost regal air, her gaze briefly sweeping over David before moving on. The meeting began with the usual reports, financials, upcoming community events, minor landscaping updates. David listened patiently, his turn coming towards the end, during the open forum for resident concerns. When his name was finally called, he walked to the podium, carrying his neatly organized folder. He spoke clearly, calmly, and methodically, laying out the facts. The absence of proper notice for the 18-foot rule, the HOA's own bylaws requiring such notice, and the unwarranted impoundment and damage to his boat. He showed the printed documents, the highlighted sections, the date-stamped emails showing the lack of communication. He presented his case with quiet dignity, never raising his voice, never making personal attacks. Mrs. Henderson listened, her expression unmoving, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. When David finished, she cleared her throat, tapped a pen against her pad, and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez," she began, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "We appreciate your thoroughness. However, the board has already addressed this matter. The rule was passed, and your boat was in violation. We stand by our decision. Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining a sharp edge, "your continuous use of the dock for private fishing charters, bringing non-residents into our exclusive community, has been a growing concern. The board views this as a significant liability." David felt a cold shock. "Private charters? Mrs. Henderson, I take the neighborhood children out for a couple of hours. For free. It's about teaching them, giving back to the community." "Regardless," she interjected, cutting him off with a dismissive wave of her hand, "it is an unapproved commercial activity. It creates a nuisance, and it reflects poorly on the pristine image we strive for in Heron Creek." Her eyes held a glint of triumph. She wasn't just defending her actions, she was creating new accusations, twisting his kindness into something negative. The other board members, perhaps intimidated by Mrs. Henderson's domineering presence, remained silent, avoiding David's gaze. "So, your decision is final?" David asked, his voice now tight with a mix of anger and deep disappointment. "It is," she stated firmly, then motioned for the next person in line, effectively ending his discussion. The meeting moved on, but David remained standing for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. She had not only dismissed his valid points but had also tried to paint him as a problem, as someone exploiting the community for personal gain. It was a vicious, unprovoked attack on his character, designed to isolate him and justify her actions to the other residents present. He slowly walked back to his seat, a new, colder resolve hardening within him. He had tried to be kind, to be reasonable, to follow the rules, but Mrs. Henderson had chosen a different path. He now knew he needed to seek help from outside the community. The very next day, David contacted a lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Davies who specialized in property law. He recounted the entire story, from his years of peaceful boat ownership to the sudden, unannounced rule and the brutal impoundment. He showed her all his meticulously collected evidence, the photos, the HOA bylaws, the communication records. A mess. Davies listened intently, nodding occasionally, her expression growing increasingly serious. She asked probing questions, delving into the specifics of the HOA's internal processes and Mrs. Henderson's past actions. David felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. Someone finally understood. Ms. Davies reviewed all the documents David had provided. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice calm and measured, "based on what you've shown me, the HOA's actions, particularly Mrs. Henderson's, appear to be a clear overreach and a violation of due process, as well as a potential act of property damage. We have a strong case for unlawful impoundment and damages. We can certainly pursue this through civil court." David nodded. "That's what I want. To get my boat back and ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Ms. Davies then leaned forward, her expression becoming more focused. "There's something else that concerns me, Mr. Rodriguez. You mentioned that Mrs. Henderson accused you of running private fishing charters and bringing non-residents into the community, calling it an unapproved commercial activity and a significant liability. Did she make any specific reference to federal laws or regulations regarding maritime activities or commercial operations during that meeting?" David paused, thinking back to the meeting. "She said it was a nuisance and reflected poorly on the pristine image. She mostly focused on unapproved commercial activity and liability. She didn't specifically say federal law, but it felt like she was trying to make it sound very serious, very official, more than just an HOA rule." Ms. Davies's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "Interesting. Sometimes, when HOAs want to exert authority, they might vaguely refer to broader statutes, even if they don't fully understand them or if they don't apply. But this mention of commercial activity and liability, particularly in the context of a boat, raises a red flag for me. I've seen situations where overzealous HOAs, in trying to enforce their rules, step into areas that are regulated by much higher authorities, like federal agencies. If she was trying to imply that your boat activities, even recreational ones with kids, were a commercial venture subject to specific federal maritime laws, and then took action based on that implication, it could be a very serious misstep on her part." She continued, "If she incorrectly applied or misrepresented federal regulations, or even implied that your actions violated them to justify seizing your property, that could be an issue that extends far beyond just an HOA dispute. For example, maritime activities, especially those involving any form of commerce or operating in federal waters, are under the jurisdiction of specific federal agencies, not local HOAs. Making false accusations or taking action under the guise of such regulations, especially regarding someone's property and their livelihood, could have significant consequences for her." David listened, a new understanding dawning on him. He hadn't thought of it in that way, only seeing it as Mrs. Henderson's bullying. Ms. Davies then explained a few examples of how certain recreational activities could sometimes be misinterpreted as commercial by people unfamiliar with maritime law, and how some HOAs might try to use such interpretations to justify their actions. She made it clear that she wasn't saying this was definitely the case, but it was a path they should investigate. Given her mention of commercial activity and liability, and the extreme measure of impounding your boat, I think it's prudent to not just pursue the civil case against the HOA for property damage and unlawful impoundment, but also to bring this entire situation to the attention of the appropriate federal agencies. It's a long shot that they would get involved over a local HOA dispute, but if there's any hint that Mrs. Henderson overstepped into their jurisdiction or made false claims about federal regulations to justify her actions, they might take an interest. It's a rare occurrence, but worth the effort. David felt a surge of cold fury mixed with a strange sense of vindication. Mrs. Henderson had tried to portray him as someone breaking serious laws, when in fact, she might be the one in deep trouble. "Do it," he said, his voice firm. "Do whatever it takes." And so, alongside preparing the civil lawsuit, Ms. Davies sent a detailed report, complete with all of David's evidence, to a specific federal agency that dealt with maritime law and commercial vessel operations. It was a long shot, as she'd said, a simple informational report highlighting a local HOA's possible misinterpretation of federal statutes. David didn't expect much from that avenue, focusing his energy on the upcoming civil case. He spent the next few days in quiet anticipation, waiting for a response from the impound lot about the Seafarer's condition, preparing for the legal battle ahead, and finding small ways to continue to help his neighbors, trying to restore some of the kindness Mrs. Henderson had tried to stamp out. He had no idea that a very different kind of response was already in motion, that the seeds planted by Mrs. Henderson's own words had taken root in a much more serious garden. The days following Ms. Davies' surprising suggestion to contact federal agencies were a strange mix for David. On one hand, he was focused on the civil lawsuit, gathering more detailed estimates for the repairs to the Seafarer, which, he had learned from the impound lot, included significant damage to her propeller shaft in addition to the hull scratches. The cost was astronomical for a man like David, cementing his resolve to fight Mrs. Henderson. On the other hand, a quiet, almost unsettling feeling lingered about the federal report. He had shared his story, provided all the facts, but then what? It felt like shouting into a vast canyon, unsure if any echo would ever return. Life in Heron Creek, meanwhile, continued its uneasy rhythm. Mrs. Henderson seemed to float through the community with an even greater air of self-satisfaction. She held impromptu inspections of people's yards, leaving terse, official-looking notices taped to front doors about overgrown hedges or flower pots that were not in compliance. David saw more and more residents quietly sighing, shrugging their shoulders, and simply complying. The spirit of shared enjoyment, of spontaneous neighborhood gatherings, felt like it was slowly draining away, replaced by a constant hum of low-level anxiety. He still spent time at the empty dock, not fishing, but just sitting, looking out at the water where the Seafarer once danced with the waves. He missed the quiet hum of her engine, the scent of the salty air on her deck. More than anything, he missed the children's laughter. Timmy and Sarah would occasionally join him, their little faces filled with a quiet sadness. David would tell them stories of the bay, pointing out distant boats and the circling gulls, trying to keep their spirits up, promising them that soon, very soon, the Seafarer would be back. He didn't want them to lose their wonder for the ocean, or their belief in fairness. He even started spending more time helping other neighbors with small repairs, offering a kind word, trying to counteract the chill Mrs. Henderson had brought. He believed that even when facing a bully, it was important to be the light, to show that kindness still existed. One sunny afternoon, a few weeks after Ms. Davies had sent the federal report, David received a call. It wasn't Ms. Davies. The number was unfamiliar, with an out-of-state area code. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Rodriguez?" a deep, professional voice inquired. "My name is Special Agent Miller. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We received a report regarding an incident involving your vessel, the Seafarer, and the Heron Creek Homeowners Association." David's heart gave a sudden thump. He sat down abruptly on the nearest chair. "Yes, Agent Miller, that's me." He had barely dared to hope for a response, let alone from the FBI. "We'd like to arrange a time to speak with you in person, Mr. Rodriguez," Agent Miller continued, his tone even and unhurried. "Preferably at your convenience, but as soon as possible." There are some aspects of the report that require further clarification. David swallowed. Of course. Whenever you need. They arranged for Agent Miller and another agent to visit his home the following Tuesday. David immediately called Ms. Davies, who was equally surprised and, he could tell, quite excited. "This is highly unusual, Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice bright. "It means they saw something in that report that piqued their interest. Just tell them the truth, exactly as it happened. Don't speculate, just stick to the facts." The tension in David's home was palpable on Tuesday morning. He had tidied up, made a fresh pot of coffee, and even nervously wiped down the already spotless kitchen counter. At precisely 10 o'clock, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled into his driveway. Two figures in dark suits emerged, just like the ones Mrs. Henderson had seen. Special Agent Miller, the man with the steady gaze and graying beard, was accompanied by a younger woman, Special Agent Chen, whose keen eyes seemed to take in everything at once. They were polite but serious. They sat in David's living room, not touching the coffee, and began to ask questions. They wanted to know everything, from the moment David bought the Seafarer to the very last fishing trip with the kids. David, remembering Ms. Davies's advice, stuck strictly to the facts. He described his long, peaceful history with the boat, his community involvement, and the enjoyment the children derived from the fishing trips. He then recounted the HOA's increasingly stringent rules, his attempts to comply, and finally, the shocking day the Seafarer was impounded. He produced his folder of meticulously organized documents, the HOA bylaws, the rule changes, the lack of notice for the 18-foot rule, and the photos of the damaged boat and dock. Agent Miller listened patiently, occasionally scribbling notes. Agent Chen, however, seemed particularly interested in Mrs. Henderson's statements during the HOA meeting. "Mr. Rodriguez," Agent Chen asked, her voice sharp and direct, "you stated that Mrs. Henderson accused you of running private fishing charters and calling it an unapproved commercial activity that created a significant liability. Is that correct?" "Yes, Agent Chen." "Those were her exact words, or very close to them," David confirmed, feeling a chill. "And during your time taking children fishing, did you ever charge money for these trips?" Agent Miller interjected, his gaze piercing. "Never," David replied firmly. "It was always free. A way to share my love for the water with the kids, to give them something fun to do. It was about community, not commerce." The agents exchanged a glance. "Did Mrs. Henderson ever, to your knowledge, inquire with any federal or state maritime authorities about your activities?" Agent Chen asked. David shook his head. "Not that I've ever heard. She just said it was a new rule and that I was in violation. She never mentioned contacting anyone outside the HOA." Agent Miller then picked up a document from David's pile, an old flyer from a community event years ago, featuring a photo of David and the Seafarer during a kids' fishing day. He also noted David's name listed on the community's volunteer roster for various cleanup drives. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, "it seems clear from your records and your neighbors' accounts that your activities with the Seafarer were purely recreational and charitable. This HOA president, Mrs. Henderson, appears to have made some rather strong and potentially unfounded claims regarding your activities. What did she stand to gain from such accusations?" David paused. "I honestly don't know, Agent Miller. Maybe she just wanted to control everything. Maybe she didn't like my boat. I just wanted to live peacefully." He talked about how Mrs. Henderson had slowly but surely exerted more control, making the community less open and friendly. He shared his observations about other neighbors facing minor but frustrating issues with her strict interpretations of rules. He described the general feeling of being watched, the erosion of the casual, neighborly interactions that used to define Heron Creek. The agent spent nearly 2 hours at David's home, meticulously going through every detail, every document, and every statement. They left with copies of everything David had, promising to be in touch. After they left, David sank into his chair, a mixture of exhaustion and a strange sense of hope washing over him. The calm, professional demeanor of the agents, their serious questions, and their obvious interest suggested that this was far more than just a simple HOA squabble. Mrs. Henderson's aggressive tactics, her accusations, and her unilateral actions might have indeed tripped an alarm far larger than she could have imagined. The next few days were excruciating. David kept replaying the conversation with the agents, wondering what they were thinking, what they would do. He tried to focus on his daily life, on helping Mrs. Rodriguez with her new garden fence, which Mrs. Henderson had already sent a notice about for being improperly stained. He tried to embody the kindness and empathy he wanted to see in the world, even as he waited for a resolution to his own ordeal. He still hadn't heard anything about his boat's return, and the impound lot was now charging daily fees, adding to his growing expenses. Then, a week after the agent's visit, something remarkable happened in Heron Creek. A quiet buzz started circulating through the community. Residents were whispering. The whispers turned into hushed conversations in driveways and over fences. The source of the excitement? Mrs. Henderson's house. David first heard it from young Timmy, who came tearing up his driveway, eyes wide with excitement. David! David! Guess what? 2 big cars just went to Mrs. Henderson's house. Like the ones that came to yours. David felt a sudden jolt. He walked to his window, trying to appear nonchalant, and looked across the street. Sure enough, 2 dark, official-looking sedans were parked directly in front of Mrs. Henderson's perfectly manicured lawn. They were unmarked, but he recognized the familiar, understated design. The same type of cars that Agent Miller and Agent Chen had arrived in. And then, as he watched, the front door of Mrs. Henderson's house opened. Mrs. Henderson herself stood in the doorway, her usually immaculate hair a little disheveled, her face pale, almost ashen. Her perfect posture seemed to have slumped, and her shoulders were noticeably rounded. Behind her, framed by the doorway, stood 2 figures in dark suits. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Chen. They were inside her house. A shiver ran down David's spine. This was it. The moment. The feds, just as the title had promised. He watched, transfixed, as Mrs. Henderson gestured weakly, her hand trembling slightly. The agent stepped inside her home, and the door closed behind them, leaving the quiet street to hold its breath. What were they saying to her? What had they found? The community held its collective breath, too, a silent, almost palpable sense of anticipation hanging in the humid air of Heron Creek. The tables, it seemed, had suddenly turned in a dramatic and entirely unexpected way. The sight of the federal agents disappearing into Mrs. Henderson's pristine home sent a ripple of quiet excitement and apprehension through Heron Creek. David felt a mix of powerful emotions, a sense of vindication, yes, but also a deep concern for the unexpected turn of events. He hadn't wished harm on anyone, only for fairness and the return of his boat. Yet, the presence of the FBI on Mrs. Henderson's doorstep meant something far more significant was unfolding. The air in the community crackled with unspoken questions. What were the feds asking her? What had she done to warrant their visit? David spent the rest of that day trying to focus on mundane tasks, but his mind kept drifting to Mrs. Henderson's house. The dark sedans remained parked outside for hours. Neighbors, usually bustling about their routines, now found reasons to be outside, watering plants or walking dogs, casting furtive glances across the street. The quiet hum of the community was replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the chirping of cicadas. He imagined the agents, stern and relentless, asking her difficult questions, perhaps even showing her the meticulous file he had provided. He wondered if she was still as composed and arrogant without her usual audience of intimidated residents. Later that evening, as dusk settled over Heron Creek, the unmarked cars finally pulled away from Mrs. Henderson's house. The street looked eerily quiet afterward, almost as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. David saw Mrs. Henderson emerge onto her porch briefly, her shoulders still slumped, her usually perfect hair now visibly disheveled. She walked stiffly, like someone carrying a heavy burden, and disappeared back inside her home. The image stuck with David, a stark contrast to the imperious woman he had known. For the first time, he saw not just an antagonist, but a person grappling with something profound, something far beyond the realm of HOA disputes. The following morning, the whispers intensified. Mrs. Henderson did not emerge from her house. Her meticulously tended garden looked a little less vibrant without her daily attention. The usual hum of her lawnmower was absent. Neighbors who usually saw her out for her morning walk or checking mail noticed her absence. It was unusual for someone who prided herself on such strict routines. The silence from her house was louder than any noise she could have made. David, despite his personal grievance, felt a strange mix of emotions. He knew she had been wrong, that she had acted with malice and disregard for others. But he also understood the weight of a federal investigation. He had seen the solemn faces of Agent Miller and Agent Chen. This was serious. He found himself hoping that whatever came of it, it would lead to a better, kinder Heron Creek, not just punishment for one person. He believed in giving people second chances, in the power of learning from mistakes. He just hoped Mrs. Henderson would learn. Amidst this quiet suspense, David decided to take matters into his own hands regarding the Seafarer. He couldn't wait for the HOA or Mrs. Henderson to make things right. He called the impound lot again, firmly stating his intention to retrieve his boat, even if he had to pay the escalating fees under protest. The impound lot, however, told him they needed authorization from the HOA or a court order. David explained that a lawsuit was pending, but they held firm. They couldn't release the boat without official clearance. It was a frustrating setback, a reminder that Mrs. Henderson's actions continued to hold his beloved vessel hostage. He decided to visit Ms. Davies, his lawyer, in person. "I still can't get the Seafarer back," he explained, feeling a surge of exasperation. "The impound lot won't release her without HOA permission, and they're not giving it." Ms. Davies listened, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, that's typical. However, with the FBI now involved, things might accelerate. I'm keeping a close eye on any developments. This level of federal interest usually puts significant pressure on local entities." She then shared some insights into how federal investigations worked. They move slowly but deliberately. They gather information, interview people, and build a case. It's not like in movies where everything happens in a flash. She explained that her report to the federal agency was initially just a simple tip-off about potential overreach and misrepresentation of federal law by a local entity. The fact that the FBI followed up meant they had found enough information to suggest a real possibility of misconduct that fell within their jurisdiction, not just a petty HOA squabble. What could they be investigating? David asked, genuinely curious. Ms. Davies leaned forward. "Well, if Mrs. Henderson, in her capacity as an HOA official, knowingly made false claims about your activities violating federal maritime laws, or used those false claims to justify seizing your property, that could potentially fall under federal purview. For example, if she reported you to a federal agency falsely, claiming you were running an unlicensed commercial operation, or if she used the threat of federal action to coerce you, that could be a very serious matter. It could involve things like obstruction of justice, misrepresentation, or even civil rights violations if her actions were seen as an abuse of authority under the color of law, even if it's HOA law. These are big ifs, of course, and depend entirely on what the FBI finds, but it's clear they are taking her actions very seriously." The implications of Ms. Davies's words were profound. Mrs. Henderson's attempts to make David's boat activities sound illegal and threatening might have backfired in the most spectacular way. She had tried to scare him with the ghost of federal law, and now the actual federal law was knocking on her door. It underscored the importance of kindness and truth. When you act with malice and deceit, the consequences can be far more severe than you anticipate. Days later, the situation in Heron Creek took another strange turn. Mrs. Henderson still hadn't appeared publicly. The HOA board, usually so quick to issue pronouncements, was unusually silent. Then, residents started receiving unexpected emails from the HOA's official account. These emails weren't from Mrs. Henderson. They were from the HOA secretary, a timid man named Mr. Peterson, who was rarely heard from. The messages were brief, stating that due to unforeseen circumstances, all upcoming HOA meetings were postponed indefinitely. There was also a short, vague notice about a temporary restructuring of the HOA leadership. No mention of Mrs. Henderson, no explanation. Just a sudden, unsettling void where her presence used to be. The next development came from a totally unexpected source, an anonymous flyer, photocopied and left in mailboxes throughout Heron Creek. It was crudely printed, but the message was clear and shocking. It detailed specific accusations against Mrs. Henderson, not just about David's boat, but about other incidents where she allegedly used her power to target residents who displeased her. It mentioned arbitrary fines, threats of liens on homes for minor infractions, and even accusations of mismanaging HOA funds. The flyer also hinted at the involvement of federal authorities, and urged residents to come forward with their own stories. David read the flyer with a sense of dismay. While he wanted justice, this felt like a public shaming, a descent into chaos. He worried it would deepen the divisions in the community rather than heal them. He wanted to believe in the goodness of people, even when they were wronged. He knew Ms. Davies would advise him to ignore it, as it was not official, but it showed how much tension had been building under Mrs. Henderson's rule, and how quickly things could unravel. Just as the community was digesting these new, unsettling developments, something truly shocking occurred. It was early evening, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine. David was just finishing dinner when his phone rang. It was Mr. Miller, his voice hushed and hurried. Mr. Miller was one of the older residents, a man David had helped with a leaky roof a few months back. He lived several blocks away, closer to the community's main entrance. "David? You need to come down to the main entrance." "Now," Mr. Miller whispered, his voice strained. "There's a lot of police cars. And something else. It looks like the feds are back, but something is really wrong." David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed his keys and rushed out the door. As he drove towards the main entrance of Heron Creek, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, piercing the evening calm. The usual quiet, tree-lined streets now felt charged with an electric tension. Rounding the final bend, a chaotic scene unfolded before him. Blue and red flashing lights pulsed through the twilight, illuminating a cluster of police cars, an ambulance, and indeed, those familiar dark, unmarked sedans. The street was cordoned off, and a crowd of stunned residents stood behind the yellow tape, their faces etched with confusion and fear. David parked his truck a short distance away and joined the hushed crowd. His eyes scanned the scene, trying to make sense of the commotion. The flashing lights seemed to converge on a specific point, the community's small, unassuming HOA office, located just inside the main entrance gates. Its windows, usually dark at this hour, were now brightly lit, casting stark shadows. Uniformed police officers moved purposefully around the building, their walkie-talkies crackling. But it wasn't just the police. The figures in dark suits, the federal agents, were also there, moving with an air of grim determination. Then David saw it. Through the brightly lit windows of the HOA office, he could discern a chaotic scene. Papers were strewn everywhere, filing cabinets were open, their contents spilling out. It looked as though a whirlwind had swept through the orderly space. And then, he saw the person. Lying on the floor, amidst the scattered documents and overturned chairs, was Mrs. Henderson. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly at the ceiling, her face even paler than it had been at her doorstep. Paramedics were kneeling over her, working quickly, their movements urgent. Her perfectly coiffed hair was now truly wild, a stark contrast to her usually composed appearance. It was clear this was not just an investigation anymore. Something terrible had happened. The scene was one of utter disarray and profound distress, far beyond anything David, or the community, could have ever imagined. The chaotic scene at the HOA office, with Mrs. Henderson on the floor and paramedics working frantically, plunged Heron Creek into a state of shocked disbelief. David stood transfixed behind the yellow tape, the flashing blue and red lights painting the night with an unsettling glow. The whispers from the crowd intensified, turning into gasps as people strained to see what was happening inside. It was clear Mrs. Henderson wasn't just being questioned, something truly dire had occurred. The kindness and empathy David usually felt for all people, even those who wronged him, were now tangled with a growing sense of dread. Emergency medical technicians worked quickly around Mrs. Henderson, their movements precise and urgent. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes, though open, seemed to stare blankly. A police officer, his face grim, held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, a paper that looked suspiciously like the anonymous flyer that had appeared in the mailboxes. David felt a wave of coldness wash over him. Had the flyer, with its harsh accusations, pushed Mrs. Henderson to some extreme point? He hadn't wished for this. He only wanted justice, not a tragedy. After what felt like an eternity, the paramedics carefully lifted Mrs. Henderson onto a stretcher. She was motionless, her body slack. They wheeled her out of the office, past the stunned crowd, and loaded her into the waiting ambulance, its siren now wailing a mournful sound as it sped away into the night. Special Agent Miller and Agent Chen emerged from the office shortly after, their faces grim. They spoke quietly with the police chief, their voices low and serious. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions and a palpable sense of unease. The feds weren't just investigating, they were now responding to a crisis. Agent Miller caught David's eye across the crowd. He approached the tape, his expression solemn. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "we'd like to speak with you again when you have a moment. Perhaps tomorrow morning at our office." He didn't elaborate, simply nodded and returned to conferring with the other officers. David agreed, his mind racing. He had been through so much with Mrs. Henderson, and now this. He went home, the images of the chaotic office and Mrs. Henderson's lifeless form replaying in his mind. The once peaceful Heron Creek felt anything but. The next morning, the sun rose on a community still reeling from the events of the previous night. The HOA office remained cordoned off, a silent testament to the drama that had unfolded. Mrs. Henderson's house was dark and quiet. The HOA email from Mr. Peterson had updated to include a brief, somber note about Mrs. Henderson's medical emergency and a continued temporary suspension of all HOA activities. The vagueness only fueled the whispers. David, true to his word, went to the federal office the next morning. Ms. Davies met him there, her face reflecting a mix of concern and professional curiosity. Agent Miller and Agent Chen greeted them, their demeanor as professional as ever, but with a noticeable shift in their solemnity. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Rodriguez, MS." Davies, Agent Miller began, gesturing for them to sit. "As you saw last night, events took a turn. Mrs. Henderson suffered a severe stress-related incident. She is stable, but will require extensive medical care and will not be returning to her duties." David felt a pang of complex emotions. He was relieved she was alive, but the extent of her breakdown was sobering. However, Agent Chen interjected, her voice firm, "That doesn't change the nature of our investigation. When we interviewed Mrs. Henderson yesterday, we uncovered significant evidence of misconduct within the HOA. It appears Mrs. Henderson, in her role as president, was not merely overzealous. We have reason to believe she was systematically misusing HOA funds, diverting a substantial portion of membership dues for personal enrichment. We also have evidence that she fabricated rules, like the 18-foot boat limit, specifically to target residents she disliked or who questioned her authority. Your boat, Mr. Rodriguez, was unfortunately one of her deliberate targets. David felt a knot of anger and frustration tighten in his chest. He had suspected she was abusing her power, but actual embezzlement and deliberate fabrication of rules designed to hurt people? That was a level of malice he hadn't fully grasped. Furthermore, Agent Miller continued, his voice grave, we believe the anonymous flyer that circulated in the community last night played a role in precipitating Mrs. Henderson's collapse. It appears to have been authored by a former HOA board member who had quietly gathered evidence against her for months but was too afraid to come forward officially. The flyer was, in essence, a public exposure of her alleged wrongdoings. When confronted with our investigation yesterday, coupled with the public shaming from the flyer, it seems the pressure became too much for her. Ms. Davies spoke up. So, the charges are beyond just a civil dispute. We're talking about federal crimes. Potentially, Agent Chen confirmed. Embezzlement, fraud, potentially even abuse of public office if the HOA is deemed to operate in a quasi-governmental capacity, which some do. We are still compiling our case, but the evidence we've found, including documents recovered from the HOA office last night and information from Mrs. Henderson's personal devices, is substantial. David listened, processing the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Henderson's actions were not just unkind, they were criminal. His boat had been a casualty of her deeper, darker schemes. What about my boat, the Seafarer? David asked, his voice cracking slightly. Can I get her back now? Agent Miller nodded. Yes, Mr. Rodriguez. Given the circumstances and the fact that the rule under which your boat was impounded was fabricated, we have already contacted the impound lot. They have been instructed to release your boat immediately, and all impound fees will be covered by the HOA's emergency fund, pending further investigation into its legitimate use. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost brought tears to his eyes, washed over David. The Seafarer was coming home. He could almost feel the familiar hum of her engine, the salty spray on his face. He thanked the agents profusely. One more thing, Mr. Rodriguez, Agent Chen added. We understand your compassion, but it's important to recognize that Mrs. Henderson's actions were deliberate and had a significant impact on this community. While her current medical condition is tragic, it doesn't erase the harm she caused. Our job is to ensure justice, not just for you, but for everyone in Heron Creek who suffered under her leadership. David understood. He knew that while kindness was important, accountability was equally vital. The news of Mrs. Henderson's medical emergency and the underlying federal investigation spread through Heron Creek like wildfire. The community, initially stunned, slowly began to express a complex mix of feelings. There was sympathy for Mrs. Henderson's health, but also a growing wave of relief and anger at the revelation of her alleged deceit. People started sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines, of small acts of defiance met with harsh warnings, of the pervasive fear that had settled over the once friendly neighborhood. The anonymous flyer was no longer a crude piece of paper but a harbinger of truth. Mr. Peterson, the HOA secretary, with a newfound sense of purpose, began to lead the charge. He called an emergency community meeting, not at the formal clubhouse, but at the sprawling community park, a neutral territory. The turnout was overwhelming. Residents who had always stayed silent, intimidated by Mrs. Henderson, now spoke up. Stories poured out, Mrs. Rodriguez about her garden gnomes, Mr. Chong about a satellite dish fine, families who were threatened with liens for having too many toys in their front yards. It was a cathartic outpouring, a collective shedding of the heavy cloak of fear. David attended the meeting, listening to the stories, feeling both sadness for what the community had endured and hope for its future. When he spoke, he focused not on his own grievance, but on the need for a kind, transparent, and empathetic HOA. He talked about rebuilding trust, about open communication, and about remembering that the HOA existed to serve the community, not control it. He spoke about the children, and how he wanted Heron Creek to be a place where they could feel free and safe, where kindness was valued above rigid rules. In the midst of this community reckoning, David received a call from the impound lot. The Seafarer was ready to be picked up. He took a deep breath, his heart swelling with anticipation. He drove to the lot, and there she was, still bearing the fresh scars of her rough handling, but unmistakably his. He paid the small, court-mandated release fee, which would eventually be reimbursed, and began the careful process of preparing her for the short journey home. He noticed the propeller shaft damage was worse than he'd thought, meaning she wouldn't be going out on the water for a while. It was disheartening, but the important thing was she was back. As he slowly towed the Seafarer back towards Heron Creek, a small parade began to form behind his truck. Children, who had heard the news, ran out of their houses, cheering and waving. Timmy and Sarah were at the front, their faces beaming with unbridled joy. Neighbors, many of whom had been silent supporters, stood on their lawns, smiling and waving. It was an impromptu celebration, a collective sigh of relief, a moment of triumph for simple decency over oppressive control. The return of the Seafarer wasn't just about a boat. It was a symbol of hope, a sign that things were changing for the better in Heron Creek. The air in the community felt lighter, a palpable shift from the tense quiet that had prevailed for so long. People started talking to each other again, sharing stories, planning spontaneous get-togethers. The community was slowly rediscovering its lost spirit. David, seeing the smiles on the children's faces, knew that his long, arduous journey had been worth it. He knew that kindness, even when met with unkindness, had a way of finding its path and inspiring others. But the story wasn't over. While Mrs. Henderson was gone and the community was beginning to heal, the investigation into her actions continued. Agent Miller and Agent Chen were still working tirelessly, compiling their case, gathering more evidence, and tracing the full extent of the alleged financial irregularities within the HOA. The return of the Seafarer was a huge victory for David, a symbol of justice, but the larger ripples of the federal investigation were still expanding, and the true legal consequences for Mrs. Henderson, and potentially others involved, were yet to be fully revealed. The next chapter would delve into the formal charges, the legal proceedings, and the lasting impact on Mrs. Henderson and the future of Heron Creek. The return of the Seafarer brought a wave of quiet celebration to Heron Creek, a visible sign that justice was slowly unfolding. David spent hours just sitting by his boat, running his hand over her hull, the gouges and scratches a stark reminder of her ordeal, but also a testament to her resilience. The repairs would be extensive, more than just a few cosmetic fixes. The propeller shaft damage meant she wouldn't be sailing for months, but at least she was home, a symbol of hope for a community rediscovering its voice. The old dock, now cleared of Mrs. Henderson's aggressive signage, felt open and inviting once more. The community meeting at the park, led by a newly emboldened Mr. Peterson, continued to gain momentum. Residents, relieved from the oppressive grip of Mrs. Henderson, felt a newfound freedom to express their long-held frustrations. They elected a temporary new board, focusing on transparency and community input. The air was filled with a sense of rebuilding, a collective effort to restore the warmth and friendliness that had defined Heron Creek before Mrs. Henderson's reign. David found himself increasingly involved, not seeking power, but offering his calm, steady presence and practical advice. He was passionate about fostering a truly supportive environment, where rules were sensible and applied with empathy, not wielded as weapons. He still believed in kindness, even for those who had wronged him, but he also believed in accountability. Meanwhile, the federal investigation into Mrs. Henderson's alleged misdeeds continued to deepen. Agent Miller and Agent Chen were a constant presence in the community, interviewing more residents, meticulously sifting through HOA financial records, and scrutinizing every document connected to Mrs. Henderson's tenure. They were quiet, methodical, and relentless. The whispers in Heron Creek now centered not just on Mrs. Henderson's health, but on the mounting evidence against her. The scale of her alleged fraud, people speculated, was far greater than anyone had initially imagined. One afternoon, David received a call from Ms. Davies. Her voice was grave. "Mr. Rodriguez, the federal grand jury has returned an indictment against Mrs. Henderson. She's been formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The amounts involved are substantial, far more than just HOA dues. It appears she was also involved in a complex scheme diverting funds from various community improvement projects, manipulating bids for contractors, and inflating invoices." David listened in stunned silence. He knew it was bad, but he hadn't imagined anything of this magnitude. This wasn't just about a boat, it was about a web of deceit that had entangled the entire community, siphoning off resources meant for everyone. The initial shock David felt for Mrs. Henderson's health was now replaced by a chilling understanding of the depth of her deception. This wasn't merely an overzealous HOA president, this was a criminal. She's currently under house arrest, recovering from her health crisis, but the legal process will begin as soon as she's deemed fit to stand trial, Ms. Davies explained. "This is a very serious federal case, Mr. Rodriguez. The charges carry significant prison sentences." The news of the indictment hit Heron Creek like a tidal wave. It was published in the local newspaper, then picked up by regional news outlets. Mrs. Henderson's name, once synonymous with strict HOA rules, was now linked to federal charges and financial scandal. The initial relief people felt quickly morphed into a profound sense of betrayal. The community had entrusted her with their money, their homes, and their collective well-being, and she had allegedly abused that trust for her own gain. The outrage was palpable. The ongoing investigation also brought an unexpected twist. Agent Miller and Agent Chen found evidence that Mrs. Henderson had been involved in an elaborate scam targeting not just Heron Creek, but several other HOAs in the broader region. She had allegedly used shell companies and false identities to secure lucrative contracts for maintenance and construction work, then massively overcharged the HOAs, funneling the excess money into offshore accounts. The scale of the operation was staggering, turning her overzealous rule into a calculated criminal enterprise. Her fixation on details and control, which David and others had attributed to her personality, was now exposed as a methodical means to an end. The boat incident, it turned out, was a tiny thread in a much larger, darker tapestry. The discovery of the multi-HOA fraud scheme transformed the investigation from a local community matter into a high-profile federal case. The FBI brought in more resources, financial investigators, and forensic accountants. The story made national news, a cautionary tale about unchecked power within seemingly innocuous community organizations. Journalists descended on Heron Creek, trying to interview residents. David, with Ms. Davies's guidance, carefully shared his story, always emphasizing the importance of community oversight and accountability. He used the platform to talk about kindness, even in the face of such deep betrayal, and how communities must come together to protect themselves from those who would exploit them. As the weeks turned into months, the federal investigation culminated in an even more dramatic development. Based on the overwhelming evidence, and perhaps facing the prospect of a very long prison sentence, Mrs. Henderson decided to cooperate with the authorities. She entered into a plea agreement, agreeing to testify against her co-conspirators in the larger multi-HOA fraud scheme. Her cooperation led to the arrests of several other individuals, including a prominent regional developer and a crooked construction company owner, who had allegedly aided and abetted her in her elaborate financial crimes. The reach of her criminal enterprise stretched far wider than anyone could have imagined. The details that emerged from her plea agreement were shocking. She confessed to fabricating the 18-foot boat rule specifically to punish David for his unwavering kindness and his quiet popularity in the community, which she viewed as a challenge to her absolute authority. She admitted to damaging the Seafarer during its impoundment, ordering the crane operators to handle it roughly. She also admitted that the unapproved commercial activity accusation against David was a complete fabrication, an attempt to publicly discredit him and elevate the perceived severity of his supposed violation to justify her extreme actions. The depths of her vindictiveness and the calculated nature of her actions stunned even the most hardened investigators. She confessed she targeted David not for any real violation, but because she saw his genuine compassion and helpful nature as a threat to her reign of fear. The court proceedings, though delayed by her health, eventually began. Mrs. Henderson, frail but lucid, appeared in federal court. David attended the sentencing hearing, not out of malice, but to bear witness, to see justice fully served. He saw a woman stripped of her power, her carefully constructed facade shattered. She received a significant prison sentence for her crimes, but a portion of it was suspended due to her health condition and cooperation. However, she was ordered to pay massive restitution to Heron Creek and the other victim HOAs, a sum that would take years, if not decades, to repay. The most profound outcome, however, was the transformation of Heron Creek itself. The community, bruised but unbowed, began a new chapter. Mr. Peterson, with David's quiet support and the help of many newly engaged residents, spearheaded a complete overhaul of the HOA. They drafted new, transparent bylaws, establishing clear checks and balances to prevent any single individual from ever wielding such unchecked power again. Community input became paramount. Committees were formed, not by decree, but by volunteer spirit. The dock was repaired and upgraded, with sensible, community-approved rules. And the Seafarer? David, with help from a GoFundMe campaign started by the grateful residents of Heron Creek, was able to fully repair his beloved boat. The community rallied, contributing funds, offering expertise, and providing emotional support. Months later, on a beautiful, sunny Saturday, a grand rechristening ceremony was held at the newly refurbished dock. Children, parents, and neighbors gathered. David, his heart full, untied the Seafarer's ropes. Timmy and Sarah, now beaming with the biggest smiles, helped him push her gently back into the water. The Seafarer, gleaming with new paint and a silently purring engine, looked more magnificent than ever. David took a moment to look at the joyful faces of the children and his neighbors. He remembered the anger, the frustration, and the sense of betrayal. But he also remembered his own commitment to kindness and the incredible way the community had come together. As the Seafarer floated gracefully, David knew that the boat, once a victim of malice, was now a powerful symbol of resilience, transparency, and the enduring spirit of kindness that ultimately prevailed in Heron Creek. The community had learned a hard lesson, but it had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before.